All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the stream. Today, we're going to be talking about the European Union, and then we'll go over some other topics that I've got later. But joining me today, we've got Ulfric.
Hello.
Dortex.
Hi.
First name, last name.
Hello.
Ragnar.
Gentlemen.
And Steelfox.
Hello.
So, before we get into the discussion, let me just clarify some things for some people who may not know. The European Union is a political and economic union of 28 member states that are located primarily in Europe. The EU has developed an internal single market through a standardized system of laws that apply in all member states. EU policies aim to ensure the free movement of people, goods, services, and capital within the internal market, enact legislation in justice, in home affairs, and maintain common policies on trade, agriculture, fisheries, and regional development. So, gentlemen, you want to give your thoughts on the European Union? Is it good? Is it bad? What's going on? What do you guys think?
I mean, something like that worked for the United States so far. You know, everyone should just take up the same economic policy if they really want to do this union thing. Otherwise, they should just, factor into their constituent states properly.
My issue with the European Union generally is that it centralizes power, and I'm not quite a fan of centralizing power to Brussels, generally speaking.
Right.
What do you have against Brussels?
I'm not a fan of centralized power at any point, so I mean, well, as a libertarian, that's kind of against my political viewpoints.
Welcome to the stream, Decadent Perspective. You are unmuted if you'd like to say hello real quick.
Yeah, hi.
And then I think we'll have one more person. Hello, Julius. Welcome to the stream. You are unmuted if you'd like to talk. So, yeah, like I said, we're talking about the EU. So if I could get everyone's thoughts here on the European Union as a whole.
Yeah, could I chime in?
Yep.
Yeah, I think generally the European Union is a good idea in theory, as many things are, but in practice and even in theory, it does indeed lead to reduced autonomy for the different states and reduced sovereignty. It doesn't just function as just an economic union. It has now even developed and is trying to develop its own military, and the bureaucrats in the European Union overwrite local laws, which I would say is the biggest threat to the individual European countries' sovereignty.
Now, what about the theory do you think is a good thing? What's the theory behind the EU that you like?
The theory that I like is sort of mostly this idea is making Europe the world hegemony.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be better if it was Europe that was the world hegemony instead of the United States. But yeah, they generally are not that affiliated with Israel and its interests, and wouldn't go out of its way to meddle in the Middle East.
Interesting take on anybody else. It seems to me that most people think that in some way, shape, or form, the concept of a common marketplace is a semi-decent idea, but it seems to be the implementation in its current form is what people seem to disagree with.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
It's not necessarily its current form either. It's the whole idea is flawed in itself because it will eventually lead to reduced sovereignty for the different states.
And I would also point out that when we look at the origins of the European Union, sort of in the circle of Count Kalergi, and something along those lines, when you take a look at these sort of circles and these sort of ideas, I think the origins of the European Union sort of flawed in its beginnings. I think the concept of a sort of united political a geopolitical front, you could say, for European countries. I wouldn't be strictly against. I would still prefer the separate countries to retain some autonomy. But I think that since its inception, I think the European Union has sort of been designed to not serve in any kind of the interest of our people.
Now, according to the conversation yesterday, does anyone here think that the EU is sort of an American concept or American construct?
No.
Yes, it is. And you hear this on the EU politicians themselves, because they themselves in the EU Parliament, they will, how would I put this? They try to sell as a United States of Europe. Oh, what a grand design. Look at America. Barely 300 years old, yet it rules the world. Perhaps Europe can get some of its power back, you know?
Right.
I mean, wouldn't it?
No.
Honest question. Like,
no, it won't. It undermines the homogeneous stability and integrity of sort of nations, of European nation states. Right? There you go. You have civil unrest. There you have more poverty, more expense for the government, less on the people who are rightfully there. That is native Europeans, as a white Dutchman, for instance. Right?
Right.
This very institution, this grand design, this project for all of Europe, it will, if not quenched, its fires will burn Europe alive.
Okay, like
Can I add something?
Just real quick, welcome to the stream, Father Sam from yesterday. Good to see you back. We're talking about the EU. If you should be unmuted if you'd like to chat.
I guess not.
Can I add something?
All right.
For it.
Yes, I do like the concept of the European Union. I don't like the United States of Europe. I think the European Union has enabled a lot of growth in Europe economically and has done a lot of good, but it's looking more like a federation because it's getting too centralized. And yes, I think the country should retain more autonomy, but it's this concept of one anthem, one flag, one people, where a lot of people in Brussels are trying to create this sort of federation of Europe.
But I keep hearing that constantly. The member states lose some autonomy, and then there's a centralized power. But you know, would you say there's a problem in the United States with this? Like, do you have a problem with the federal government in the United States?
The problem is the thing is, when you were talking about the US, it was the fundamental idea of when you declared independence from Great Britain was to have a single nation. Even like that was never the intent behind Europe as a whole. Like, Europe has had distinct cultures and countries for.
Okay, can you nibbers hear me now?
There you go. Welcome.
Yeah. I unplugged my mic to unfuck my phone, which apparently wiped itself.
Yeah, well, I think the just like the federal government of the United States, it doesn't work because it's sort of stamping on the sovereignty of the individual states, as far as I'm concerned. Because you have to realize the United States is massive. The culture between two states that even border one another is completely different. They even have their own dialects of English sometimes. They want to rule themselves, and I think that they have the moral authority to have that sort of political autonomy, and I wouldn't want to subject them to a wide-ranging state. The reason why that the United States is so bureaucratic and has so many of these laws, well, one of the reasons, is because they have to take into account 50 other states. It's a nightmare. And the same thing applies to the European Union. I don't think that it's, I think it's morally reprehensible that a council in Brussels can legislate against a member who doesn't want to be legislated on. And if they try to leave, they'll get fined or they'll have economic sanctions put on them or something. Yeah. So that to me is an egregious violation of national autonomy. So I think that the fundamental concept behind the EU is a disaster and should be abolished.
No, because the fundamental concept behind the EU was literally this trade union that would standardize, measurements for railways, container sizes, all this economic integration that you would like. But what it becomes is a transnational governmental body, right, that basically dictates who gets what, and also levies a tax on the member states. This
I see that as an inevitability.
Hopefully never part of the agreement, but eventually it has turned into that, right? And it also constantly expands its power, right, to the fucking Balkans for some reason, to Ukraine, to Turkey, right? All these unstable economies that aren't fit to be integrated into the union at all.
I'd also say that it's a bit more than that, because also this one flag, one anthem, and this sort of also not just standardization, even more than the original standardization of sort of measurements or such. You also see sort of at least they're trying to standardize the countries and also probably the culture, so that it'll be a lot easier to sort of control.
But it's like Mimir said, though. The same thing happened in the U.S. Like the culture between the states is pretty different, right?
And I think you can do standardization without having to legislate people.
You speak the same language and you have the same history.
You all speak the same language too.
Not necessarily. The United States doesn't.
You can achieve standardization without the use of a transnational organization.
And something that outsiders don't understand is that the United States
standardization could be voluntary. That's completely legitimate.
That's what I was talking about earlier. But yeah, it can be voluntary.
That's not going to happen. That's actually not going to happen.
Look at the implementation of the metric system. That's completely voluntary. No one's forcing the majority of countries to use it.
Good luck doing
science without it. It's easier to use it than to use the imperial system.
Well, exactly, because it's beneficial for them to use it, so they use it, and it's.
Right, but that's not culture, though, right? Like, we're not talking weights and measures, right? Because I can totally I can understand
standardization. So standardization in trade which is what the European Union was supposed to be in the beginning.
Right, but now we're talking cultures. Talking cultures, though, and then that's never going to happen. Like, you'll borrow from each other. That's always happened. But like standardization, everyone's going to have the same culture. No,
that's what we're.
Yeah, we're not talking about culture. We're talking about weights and measures there for a sec. But the cultural thing, yeah, it's the exact same as the United States. Not every state has the same history. Many people don't see it like that. They see it much in the same way as Europe does, because that's how humans naturally operate. They try and find the lowest common identity that they can find with other people. And in particular places like Texas, there's a lot of state pride rather than national pride. It's kind of a mix of both. But if it came down to it, people in Texas would rather secede from the United States and stay Texas if that means not being subjected to the laws and culture of California or New York, because their populations are exploding and they're sending refugees into our state, which means our politics are getting more and more liberal. And because the United States can dictate certain aspects of the border and border control, we can't really stop this massive invasion from the southern borders. So it's oh man, it's such a fucking shit show. But the thing about voluntary, sort of this universalizing of weights and measures, things like that, you can do that without having a legislative body. You just have to come to an agreement with other countries.
No, you need a legislative body for that. Everybody comes together, they sit in the room,
you could have
the agreements, they sign the agreements, and then it's a fact.
Like, everything could be voluntary on the state level.
This is what you do with infrastructure. This is what you do with creating little new islands or keeping the water out. You need an organization to put people together to make the agreements in the first place and make sure these agreements are actually upheld, and to manage the money to go into the specific undertakings.
Right, but all this is kind of my point, that we've done this before. It's very much the same in the U.S. Okay, our first language is the same. I'll give you that.
Well,
but besides that, our histories are different. We had civil wars and everything, and ultimately, we even tried giving states more power in the past. horrible effect. They started competing with each other and hurting each other's economies. The federal government didn't get this powerful because some sneaky Jews were in the background pulling the wool over our eyes. No, we realized, that the federal government should be more powerful, and maybe this scale's tipped too far in that direction. But it's better than the alternative, as far as we know.
No,
So
I
why
don't
not
think
the
that's
same
the issue at all. Like, eventually your nation isn't going to survive political fragmentation, and whether that's the South wanting to do things their way, or in our age, California wanting to break off and become a full-on leftoid communist state, right, that basically runs off federal money, but that's a different story. Your country isn't going to survive that. And the very fact you mentioned the Civil War basically indicates that having a country purely based on a political agreement isn't possible, especially once the various corners of it in the fringes start veering off a national policy course, because it's starting to hurt everybody else.
But we survived the civil wars.
Well,
no, a lot of people died in the civil wars.
Well, yeah, people died in the war. It wouldn't be a war if people didn't. I mean, the country itself, the states weren't dissolved. They didn't secede and form new countries. Everyone they came together eventually. Clearly, we can survive civil war and polarization.
By force.
They come together and forced them together. There is a difference there.
You can still see a very distinct cultural divide between the North and the South to this day.
Absolutely. But nonetheless, we fly the same flag. We have the same military.
Which generally splits down the secession lines. So, I mean, there are still traces of the Civil War in today's America.
Absolutely. But nonetheless, we fly the same flag. We've got the same military. We respond to the same federal government. This position that the federal government shouldn't exist is a fringe. I don't think anyone. Maybe one guy here would agree that's a tenable position.
Well, I would say that the U.S. in an optimal situation needs to break up into at least, I would say, maybe 3 to 4 nation states, rather than being one giant federal state. The fucking communism.
I don't even think anybody's saying that the federal government shouldn't exist. It's just that the federal government can run its course for plenty of Americans.
I'm sorry, but how did we go from what is the European Union to how is the United States structured politically and how should it survive in the future?
We're comparing apples and oranges. Shush.
Well, maybe we're comparing Gala apples and Granny Smiths, but yeah. Okay, so back to the EU. The thing is, though, I see this with the state, and in particular neoliberal states like the European Union. It starts off with good intentions, right? Okay, we're going to make an economic marketplace. Sure, that's fine. That concept can work. The problem is that when you give them certain legislative powers to solve disputes between nations, it's going to devolve into the way it's devolved into now. So I think that having a common marketplace and then forcing nations to abide by certain rules, otherwise you're going to sanction them or fine them, I think is pretty ridiculous. Any comments, anybody?
What's your alternative?
What's my alternative?
Stop sovereignty.
Break it up.
Yeah, break it up.
Not having it.
Well, what's the Scandinavian version? I forget what it's called.
The Nordic Council.
The Nordic Council. Yeah.
Which is completely voluntary
And useless.
Right.
Well, it's not useless.
Voluntary cooperation? Well, I never.
How's that been working out for you?
It's a series of committees
that decide on where to place the logo on the washing utilities.
That's not accurate. Be quiet.
It is.
Stop with your fucking meaning.
It is.
It's a series of committees, generally on economic issues, environmental issues, social issues,
underwater borders. That is their biggest peeve.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a space for countries to air grievances, but the problem is that if you break up nation sovereignty, you end up with things like World War I and II. So there should be a space in which countries, especially neighboring countries, can come together and air their grievances. But I think that when you give that council or whatever too much power, it automatically devolves into something like the European Union, where there's, you know, like migrant quotas, and you have one country, basically Germany, leading the whole goddamn thing. Things like that, I think, are an inevitability with the concept as a whole.
But doesn't the European Union have unelected officials, though?
No, you have European Parliament and you have the European Committee, and the committee is basically has all the power and is unelected, and then you have European Parliament, which is staffed with a bunch of retards. Okay, so it sounds like the committee is the problem. The retards at least pretend to represent you. The you know, like the lack of representation is the problem.
Actually, no? It's mostly people who want to secede from the European Union that are European Union parliamentarians.
No, that's not true at all. Like, at least 67% is communists and socialists.
But you elect the communists and socialists. Like, what's the complaint?
Wait, do you guys think that Greece should leave the European Union? That would be the best thing for Greece to do.
And
all of them.
Yes, what I was going to say before is I think I would also like to see a currency system where Southern Europe and Northern Europe have different currencies, because I just don't think Greece,
yeah, but that's not
Portugal
going to happen.
Could have the same currency as Germany.
On its current course, it's set to expand. Bulgaria is going to be integrated into the EU, right? Romania is going to be integrated into the EU. They're giving fucking Turks free visas to run into the EU as well, which can only be exploited to its maximum capacity. Right.
Yes,
this union doesn't make sense, and it is made to destabilize the economic region.
Yeah, but although that would be a better solution, first last name, it still ignores the intricacies of the different economies and the different policies they have.
Yes, no, I would.
It's not that it's a shitty idea. It's just that there's so many underlying problems that we're not even going to get there.
Yes, what I was going to say is I would like for them just to leave the European Union, abandon the currency.
Well, Greece isn't even such a problem, right? Greece is 3% of BVP, right? And Italy is also about to keel over, and that is 15%. That problem is going to be 5 times as large, and that's basically going to break the EU over its back, over its knee, whatever.
It's a lot of its clients want to leave the European Union.
So Greece is a situation that they're able to contain. It's also slightly artificial because they left Greece in the EU to devalue the currency to improve Germany's export position. This is already basically how we're one united Europe. So
hello? Did he cut out?
If it does, it's going to be a huge disaster.
Well, let's transition the topic just a little bit. Is everyone here familiar with Richard Spencer's plan for the EU?
No. Wow, that's mostly fantasy.
I have a vague idea. Like,
okay, well let's. I know it's a fantasy of his, but let's talk about it because I think it's important to talk about. So his dream is essentially to keep the EU alive in its current form. Introduce right-wing political advisors into it, subvert the system, and then take it over and reestablish it as sort of a pan-European legislative body in order to defend the continent as a whole from foreign invaders. That is his plan. What do we think about that?
I see your fantasies, and I raise you. What if Germany won World War I?
Pretty much, but
it sounds like political Islam, but like for white people,
you know, like
conceptual penises.
What the EU is right now is a very politically aware organization. You, as a right winger, are not going to get into the European Commission. You are not going to be advising anything. And while I do agree with Richard Spencer that we need a global bond or cooperation of all whites against, you know, coloreds and everybody else, to create these official organizations, while we can more or less have, you know, bodies of cooperation instead, it just seems strange to me. It's a very American idea.
Yeah, that was my explanation as well. It's a very Americanized concept, and I think that this is fairly prevalent among some of the dissident right, that they would like to reestablish some form of EU, but they just want to make it right wing. And I think the primary issue with this is that it fails to take into account the problems that the EU has right now will be the same sort of problems if it's established even if it's established by right wingers. It's just going to be a different set of problems. The problem is you're stripping certain nations of autonomy and pitting them against one another.
Well, even then, Europeans already have an established history and identity, even though that's like rapidly fading away.
Right.
We want to avoid basically an inter-EU war at all costs, right? Because I hope it's not a meme that right-wingers constantly say, no more brother wars, guys. Right? You know, you want to avoid people flying at each other as much as possible. And you do that by not imposing your will arbitrarily on the other, right? These people already have established independent bodies. Let them do their thing. You can help them, but don't start dictating what they're supposed to do, because what you get then is that you're not compartmentalizing your own nation, right? You want to protect yourself from the influence of others if they don't agree, but you do want to help them if they spread your political influence by, you know, advocating basically the same positions you do, which is why, you know, Orban is still in the Christian center-right Democrats in European Parliament. Nobody likes him in that party, but they keep him in there because Orban is crazy popular in the European Union, right? So he gets votes for all the conservatives in Parliament.
Could I say something real quick from the chat? The guy says, I'm not saying that Richard's plan will work, but he's thinking of long-term solutions, and we're arguing about that instead of introducing new methods is ridiculous. I already talked about methods for the future. Cooperative councils that are voluntary for nation states to join so that they can air their grievances. The problem with Richard Spencer is that I don't trust his motives, first of all. Second of all, we already talked about the EU as a concept is going to devolve into the same issues that it has right now. So I think we need to just completely strip ourselves of any notion that this plan is going to work. A pan-European legislative body is never going to work. Anyway.
It just bothers me that we're speaking of nations losing autonomy as if that's inherently bad.
It is, because that leads to things like World War I and II.
Oh my God.
These people, you know, they have lived separately, well, more or less separately for hundreds of years, right? They have their own culture, their own way of doing things.
And
Greeks
up until the
don't like
European
Germans
Union
telling them what to do. You know, they don't like that Germans don't want them to go enjoy a pension while they're 40. They don't like them dodging taxes, and the Greeks are like, well, I'm supposed to dodge taxes and never work in my life.
Okay.
You know, those are irreconcilable positions.
Wait, Dortex, the US and Europe are different. You're trying to put the American system in Europe. They're inherently different.
But
there's no history.
That is like an awful crime. You know, he can do whatever he wants to do, and then I'll try to explain the reality of those positions.
Dortex. Are you from the States, by you know, any chance?
Technically.
Right.
Oh boy, that's a great answer.
Yeah. Well, anyway, would you like the United States of America to run by, let's see, Luxembourg? Would you find that? Would you find that advantageous?
We'll just think about this.
I don't know what Luxembourg is.
This little smudge on Europe. No power whatsoever. It has perhaps money, but yet it gets to tell you how to run your nation, how you put your taxes, how your citizens are supposed to live in their own lands. Does this sound fair to you? Does this sound like a nice thing?
Ragnar, I need you to like tone it down like 2 notches. Puerto Rico's already in that situation, and considering the locals, yes, any country would be better off subverting the local population. I'm not personally bothered by that.
Jesus Christ.
That is quite a position. Could you elaborate?
The average IQ here is 85. That is to say, half of the population literally cannot serve in the military. They're too goddamn stupid to even be put on a battlefield to get shot in the face. Yes. As long as they're not brown, the country is welcome to run this place. Because,
well, that's your perspective, and I agree with your perspective, but you have to realize that the United States is at this point, it's a loose amalgamation of nations or of nation states that generally just don't want to go to war with each other because it's pointless. Now, I do not want to be ruled like, okay, let's say that California, New Mexico, and Arizona get flooded with every single person from Mexico, and the federal government just allows it. Now, what does that do to the voting power of the native peoples of America? Well, it basically means that we can just fuck off and we're going to be subjected to their laws. That's the problem, is that someone who doesn't live in my community, they're hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. They have a different way of thinking, a different culture. Many of them speak a different language if we're talking about Spanish, but there's different dialects of English within the United States as well. You know, some people in the North don't like the way the people in the South talk. Some people in the West don't like the way that the Northerners talk. It's not going to work.
Thank you very much.
But anyway, it's not going to work because that's how humans operate. So if we're going to assume the position of we should use the state as a tool to operate within the natural laws of the planet, we have to recognize that people generally can't work together under a legislative body that's so large and encompassing such a wide-ranging territory and different groups of people. It will never work. But okay, so the only way it will work potentially is if the state is, you know, like a soul-crushing communistic state with purges and gulags and shit like that, where everyone's just afraid to speak out against it. That's how the Soviet Union was able to hold on to its territory for so long, even though their economic system was shit. They basically just pointed a gun at every single person and said, hey, you got to stay in here or we're going to massacre your entire population. That's the only way that these massive international states can work. That's the problem.
And I also have a problem how we're talking here like genocide's inherently bad.
It is. It's inherently bad.
Like I wouldn't have a problem if they genocided the people here. You know,
or
if they catch me, you know,
the European people because it would be good for the European Union. You wouldn't care.
You know, we could also genocide the brown people. That'd be even better for the world. You know.
Yes, but what if they decide it's better to genocide the Europeans?
The brown people are going to genocide the Europeans from their mud huts and sticks.
No, the European Union and
it's this is a much more likely scenario than vice versa.
Yeah, let's keep the discussion not on attacking brown people and keep it on the EU as a concept.
Fair enough, but yeah, the world's changed, and the best and most reliable way to avoid war and discord on Earth is economic interdependence, and it comes with its problems, right? I'm not like some expert on EU economics. I'll admit that freely, but certainly not being able to declare war on Germany, or Germany not being able to declare war on some state that's resisting its immigrant policies because it needs the member state, is a good thing, no? Like, we at least agree on that.
Am I understanding you correctly in saying that it is a good thing that let's just take Norway as an example, or as a hypothetical. We don't agree with if it were to happen that there's an election, some people win, ends up, you know, very, very anti-immigration. And they say to the Germans, they say, yeah, we don't like the immigration policy that you dictate from Brussels.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't matter to the Germans because they know they're going to get away with it because their economies are so intertwined now. And if they were to try and get out of it, Norway would be fucked. How does this seem like?
I mean, what's the alternative? Like as it stands, before the European Union formed, we had 2 world wars, the likes of which no one has ever seen.
No, you're jumping the gun here. What? No. Before the EU, before the coal and steel union, tell me, what did nations in Europe, what did they do to conduct trade between each other?
They had tariffs.
had bilateral trade agreements. One country went to the other one went to the other. We want to trade. Let's get an agreement going.
No one's saying that they can't trade with each other without that. You know what I'm saying? But they also had lots of wars. You know, they weren't like so economically intertwined that they couldn't just decide, okay, this guy's going to die. We need resources. This guy's going to die.
I don't buy your war argument. You know why?
Okay.
Great powers and nuclear weapons. Sorry. War in Europe? No, sorry.
Another problem with that is
even without the European Union, no buying it.
Okay, and tell me more about that.
Also, another thing, actually spending any money on the military nowadays.
Also, another thing, if we didn't have the European Union, we would still have NATO, and nobody fucking messes with NATO.
Well, see, that's the thing.
Like most of the West and even most of Europe is in NATO.
So NATO is a good one. It's one of these voluntary agreements that countries can join into. And yeah, there are some rules. Yeah, I know the whole U.S. hegemony thing, but in theory, you know, it's a voluntary cooperative agreement. And if you want to join, you got to have some standards. That's about it. But if you don't want to join, no problem. The thing is, it's beneficial for smaller nations with less resources to join in order to get protection from the United States. But I'm not sure where you're getting at, Dortex, with this. Are you defending the EU, or?
I'm like most things in life, everything's got, you know, good and some bad. I understand there are unelected officials in the union making decisions, mainly immigration, that, you know, obviously member states should be able to fight. We agree that you shouldn't be inviting migrants over, and well, really invaders, replace your population. I got you there. If you want to fight about it, I give up immediately. At the same time, economic interdependence really is the greatest mechanism for promoting peace in any situation. And is that really a price you'd be willing to pay?
Dortex, fuck peace. It undermines the nation state.
Dortex.
Maybe that's better or worse. I don't know, man. But you know, we got to talk about this.
And again, the European situation is that of NATO dominating Europe. It's most of the European nations are in Europe, in NATO. I mean,
but yeah. Who spends the most? Who spends the most? Let's be honest. In NATO, which is the biggest military? Who? We understand in theory Spain or something might be able to help out if there's a conflict, but who's really going to step in the moment a NATO state is invaded? The U.S. Like no one's expecting any other country to pick up the slack.
That's the point of NATO, though. That's the whole point. It's a military agreement. But just like if you try and apply that to the EU, now you basically have one country being an imperialist on other countries because they basically have all the power. If one country has the biggest economy and the most resources, and the most people, if they can dictate the rules of the EU, then it's basically just their empire that they can rule over. I guess one of the
it's effectively the Fourth Reich, to be honest.
NATO is not defending against the invasion we are currently experiencing, right? Because it's not warfare anymore. Now you use masses of people, and that's as good as any military.
Right.
And maybe that's better. Maybe it's worse. But you know, there's something to be said for the fact.
It doesn't matter if it's better or worse. Is it an effective strategy for the opponent you're facing, and for the third world? That is a resounding yes.
But anyway, Dortex, my general NATO point was that it seems that you think that every European nation is independent to do whatever the fuck they want if they don't have a European Union. They don't. A lot of them are in the same military agreement. So what's the point of them fucking over each other when they're gonna get fucked by the fucking USA and every other NATO state?
Tell me more about NATO. Exactly what countries are in it? Because I know the US is in it. I'm pretty sure the UK is in it.
Most of Europe is in it. But let's pretend that America wasn't in NATO and someone attacked Europe. You would have the German, French, Italian military, etc., working together, and they're pretty powerful. So you don't need the American military to take care of Europe.
The French military.
The majority of Europe.
Yes, the French military is one of the biggest in the world. So they could defend themselves.
I'd also say just something on the point of war in Europe and independence. The countries, the actual sort of people, the spirit of the people, the sort of the willingness of the people, the normal population to go to war with each other. You know, maybe in the Nordic countries we banter about the Danes banter about conquering southern Sweden or something, but or the Germans with Alsace-Lorraine or something along those lines. But really, there's no countries in Europe that has these militaristic imperialist plans. You might say the Germans have them economically, but there aren't this great. No European countries want really to go to war with each other again.
That might be a consequence of their economic ties with each other. Like once one country falls, they all fall. Their economies are pretty much tied together.
If anything, the current economic integration is more reason for warfare. We already have basically France dictating to other countries that they're not allowed to use electronic nets, for instance, for fishing. So people have to go back to drag nets, right? And you have to use heavier engines on your boats. But they were basically jealous that because they don't invest in a modernized fishing fleet, that the countries that do can't do that because they'd catch more fish more efficiently for a cheaper price, and then they'd outcompete that. So while there is economic integration and political integration, you still have certain countries dictating to others what they can and cannot do, even if it is more efficient economically. They use political force to stifle other opponents. And now, instead of using guns, it is merely, through a vote.
Can I make a point on NATO just because someone asked earlier if anyone knew the member states of NATO, and I can tell you, I'm looking at the map now on their own pages. It's Central Europe, most of Eastern Europe, minus Ireland, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Serbia.
Did the Ukraine officially join, or are they?
Or contentious?
No.
We're basically violating every treaty we ever made with the Soviet Union.
Turkey is marked as a member, though, but it's funny because I thought they weren't a full-fledged member, but according to this, they are. So,
part of the original agreement was that we wouldn't infringe on pact countries, and that's the Balkans,
they're a NATO member,
Baltics, Poland, Ukraine, but now we're basically encroaching ever closer to Moscow, and the Russians are sweating bullets.
Okay, so now let's transition a little bit. Can I get everyone's final thoughts on this discussion? And we'll start from the top down. Ulfric, final thoughts on the EU?
It should be abolished.
Right. But decadent perspective. You've been kind of quiet. Any final thoughts on the EU?
Final thoughts on the EU. I just have to say that I think it would be saved if it were given a more right-wing agenda. But of course, I agree that wouldn't be the case. So, final thoughts. I agree. I think it should disintegrate.
Okay. Dortex, final thoughts?
Any problems we face from an economically integrated Europe are probably better than ones we would face from a disintegrated Europe.
All right. We still have some contention with that, but Father Sam, last thoughts?
Well, Europe is obviously disintegrating for a very good reason. And I think this conversation further highlights, what Dugan writes. People are attracted to their perception of reality, and I don't think anybody has changed his mind tonight.
All right. First, last name, final thoughts?
Yes, I would like to see the European Union collapse in the coming years, but I think there should be a trade and military agreement or union.
It's reasonable. Julius, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'd also say that the European Union, as it stands now, should be abolished, especially with the heritage. When you look at, again, the Kalergi plan and other things, But I think, as last name said, that a common sort of European geopolitical force or geopolitical sort of a common front that they could put up against the rest of the world would be a good thing. But it would need to be rebuilt from the bottoms up.
All right, Ragnar.
Dismantled completely.
Nice and sweet. And Steele, final thoughts.
I agree with Julius and first last name, in the sense of it needs to be a voluntary organization, generally speaking, and no direct power from the organization's body, so to say.
No legislative
power.
The
sovereignty of the state should be the supreme thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, and this is where I also would agree with the libertarian perspective, because we can agree on national autonomy in that sense that it's an essential part of any state that the nation and the people therein that it represents have autonomy in not only their economic and military decisions, but the ability to legislate and operate themselves as they see fit. So we'll move on. I've got some other topics, but if anyone here in the Discord wants to bring up a discussion to talk about, you're free to do so. Doesn't necessarily have to be politics, but if it's relevant. Is everybody
Can we finally do the robot overlords, please?
Oh no! It's for anybody who doesn't know, Dortex is a big, huge tech nerd, so that's what he's into.
Another thing on the EU, they raised the membership fee today, by the way.
Oh yes, that's another great example.
Yeah, we talk about some news.
There's another thing that actually came up. There was an old treaty with, I think, what was it, OPEC countries, to have warm relationships with the Middle East, and the EU would basically placate them by enriching Europe with Arabic culture. I'm actually going to look up the link because I have it saved somewhere on Telegram.
Well, in the meantime, any thoughts on the new developments with North Korea? Do we think that we're going to see a reunification or some sort of bilateral trade agreement like we were just talking about? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, it looks like they're working towards cooperation, at least.
Take it on face value, I would say. It looks nice. Problem is, of course, I mean, wouldn't it be great? North and South Korea get their shit done and then work. It's great.
I have no idea what's going on.
But the problem is, as I was about to say, is given the history of North Korea, because this isn't the first time that the media suddenly got a big hard-on for what happens in North Korea in regards to North and South relations, and that they talk to each other and have a dialogue. This has happened before. And what happened? Nothing.
Well,
now it's happening again. So you risk this again being the case, in which, if it is, a lot of people are going to get disappointed. And the other thing is, I have a terrible time trying to judge what's happening in the Korean Peninsula, because I know very little, and I don't know if it has been some news outlets. Newsbud perhaps comes to mind as someone who may have talked about this in regards to what the Chinese. How do you deal with it? That is the Chinese question in regards to North Korea. What was said by the Chinese? What was said to the Chinese to make the shit start? Right, because right before this big shebang, this almost very symbolic brotherly reunion, Kim Jong-un went on his first public visit to China and Xi Jinping. That was right before this happened. That is no coincidence, right? So that is the question mark. What the hell happened in China? Some words were spoken somewhere. What happened? And I can't seem to get the bullseye on it.
Right.
Okay, someone explain to me what's been going on in Korea, because I've the LOL binge has left me disconnected.
All right, so
I have some news regarding North Korea. It seems that North Korea has just released all U.S. detainees at the request of President Trump. At least that's what I don't know where he's writing from, but it seems Ryan Fournier. I can just check out who he's writing for, but it seems reliable.
It seems that North Korea has come to an agreement to release a group of detainees. But for those of you who don't know, North Korea's nuclear testing capabilities have basically collapsed in on themselves, quite literally. They had a production facility in the mountains, and it basically caved in on itself because they lacked the ability to build anything. And
you mean in a mountain that's not a mountain anymore?
Is it not a mountain anymore? I heard it was a mountain.
No, it fucking collapsed.
The whole mountain?
Yeah.
Yeah, the mountain collapsed in on itself.
I thought it's just wow. Okay, that's a little bit news
Well, they
to me.
knew it was going to collapse.
You've seen the diagrams of how the North Koreans most likely conducted their nuclear testing, which was underground inside a mountain, inside a very, very deep mine shaft.
Right.
Interestingly enough, somewhat of a side note, but interestingly enough nonetheless, it is thought that the Iranians had the exact same idea in regards to the Frodo research facility in Iran. Interestingly enough, but they kept doing, making their bombs and exploding them. The seismograph and the radiological detection, confirmed this with little doubt previously. Not only the North Korean propaganda channel, as much as I love to watch their news presenter talk about their great achievements, and they kept doing this. And as far as I understand it, what happened was they kept doing this, and eventually the mountain couldn't withstand the pressure. It couldn't withstand the shock waves from the continuing explosions, and it, as was stated by Steele, collapsed on itself. So their number one nuclear test site is rubble.
Yeah. So basically, and this is my own personal belief, that because they're now much further behind on research and production, they've decided to work with Trump and South Korea, Mr. Moon, in order to reach some sort of peace agreement. Because I think the way that the United States has been posturing for the past couple of months, if not a year and a half or so, is that we will fuck Korea up, North Korea, I mean, and we're not afraid to do it. And Trump is not like the past presidents who have just kind of ignored the problem. I think he will legitimately fuck things up if North Korea steps out of line. So in order to not only preserve the country and his image, but to gain some glory in the eyes of his people, Kim Jong-un has decided to meet with the president of South Korea. They shook hands. They stepped over the DMZ on both countries for the first time ever, I think. They talked about ending the Korean War, and I believe that they're going to demilitarize some of the DMZ. There was some
They already have. They have. South Korea started taking down their loudspeakers that they blast K-pop from into North Korea, and the North Koreans did the same.
Okay,
North Korea removed a number of artillery pieces.
Yes, and they're trying to remove some of the minefields, but there's millions of mines and other explosive devices planted. So I think they're in the stages of trying to remove all that. Go ahead. Julius, did you have something you wanted to say? Sorry, I cut you off earlier.
No, nothing more. It was just that detainees note.
Okay. Now Dortex, you had something.
Let me see if I get this right. North Korea stood there playing a game of nuclear chicken with the entire world. Turns out the car broke down at the last second. An entire mountain collapsed with their production facility. And now that they can't make a nuclear bomb, and they have
test facility.
Okay, fair enough. Now that their testing facility collapsed and they can't test their nuclear weapons anymore, they suddenly realize they need to defuse this situation that they've escalated. So they're meeting up with the U.S. and South Korea and demilitarizing what is ostensibly a demilitarized zone. Yes?
To some extent. But the thing is,
there's a little bit more.
The main issue with the North Korean bombs is their yield is equivalent to the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And only half as reliable.
Puny.
Well,
puny as hell.
A lot of people can still die, especially if it's in South Korea, which is a very heavily populated area.
That's their main issue. Like, they're working with 19 60s era technology.
Yep, along with the rest of their military. And I would say that I would give credit to Trump for not pussyfooting around this issue, because it would appear that this all kind of comes to a head. Yeah, there's a lot of different things that you might attribute to this as a whole, but I think there's lots of moving parts in this, and I think Trump is one of them. And even the South Koreans themselves have said that without Trump, there would not have been this type of agreement. So I hope that clarifies things.
I'll much rather give the credit to Rex Tillerson, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I don't say Trump personally. I mean his entire administration as a whole, not just him. But
even has. Sorry, go ahead, Julius.
Yeah, it was actually something about something you said before, Ragnar, with the meeting in China that Kim Jong-un had, because when you look at China, you sort of see a much more effective North Korea, a totalitarian state. I don't know if you've just seen it, but there's plans in China to begin to have to give people a social score, which depends
the social credit system.
Yes, the social credit system. Yeah,
and other things like that. So you see, it's a extremely oppressive state, and it's not sort of far off from North Korea in that regard. So I think it sort of opened Kim Jong-un's eyes up maybe to what he could actually accomplish if he opened up his country.
Yes, that's what I think.
Because,
I think he's tired of starving his people.
Yeah, China has sort of opened up a bit more, but they hadn't. The leaders still sit on the power, so he could probably have told them something to the likes of, even though you open up the country, you can still retain power, and you can even do it even better. Due to all the censorship you can enact through digital through the digital world with phones that everybody you can through the new technology.
Well, that would be a very interesting thing, though, wouldn't it? North Korea adopting essentially Chinese a model of Chinese governance.
This is what China wants. So the whole thing about China is that they need a buffer zone from the allied South Korea and North Korea. That's why they propped up North Korea for so long, because they're a ideologically similar area, and of course they can keep North Korea under their toes. But essentially, I think what China will be posturing for in this whole agreement is that North Korea retains its sovereignty as a nation, so no reunification, and in return, for that, China will work with Kim Jong-un to supply him with technology and equipment and things like this to sort of modernize the country, and they'll become sort of a semi-puppet Chinese state in order to really reaffirm that buffer zone between the East and the West. That's I think is the least optimal situation for the United States and for the North Korean people as a whole.
Well, haven't they always been sort of a puppet state to China?
Yes, but with the sanctions and everything, China cannot openly send advisors and technology and equipment there, at least not the amount that would be required to modernize the country. Because I think China wants to turn them into a modern military state. I think that is their goal.
Definitely. North Korea also needs massive investments in its infrastructure.
Yes, absolutely.
Everything is crumbling.
Yes, and that's yes, and that's a very fine point, because here you go. Here comes Xi Jinping with his Belt and Road initiative, the New Silk Road, and if you think this grand scheme, one of the most grandest building project in modern history, it does not touch is not fought to touch North Korea. I mean, it will, and that is one of what I can guarantee you. It's one of the goals of the new Silk Road initiative that Xi Jinping has championed since coming to power in China.
Can I say something?
Yeah, should.
Yes. All I wanted to add was that I think North Korea and the North Korean government has planned a modernization of the country. So when Ragnar before said, why did Kim Jong-un go to China to meet with the Chinese president, I would guess that he did that to brief the president on what is going to be executed. like the plan.
Right.
I personally believe they promised the mineral rights to a bunch of rare earth metals in the North Korean mountains.
Yeah,
Well, I think it's very good what's happening.
That is a really underreported fact. The same thing with Afghanistan as well. But in regards to North Korea, like China, happens to sit on quite the amount of rare earth minerals. Of course, the Chinese want this because they want to control the trade.
And the U.S. wants this as well.
Yes.
They also want to undermine Chinese influence in the region, essentially to keep this sort of international communism. I know they're in a mixed economical system so as to avoid collapse, but they're very, very much interested in aligning with different states that share a similar ideology. All right. Any other thoughts on North Korea? Anybody? On what's going on? What hopes, expectations, plans? If you had 5 minutes to speak with Trump, what would you say? Nuke the Chinese?
No, God, no! Don't do that.
No more wars,
What I
fuck.
would truly like to see is if North Korea starts buying up modern Chinese military equipment, because I would like to see the North Korean military modernize and have modern fighter jets instead of having like their tacky 1950 Soviet era planes.
Literal T-34 85s. Where
Yeah.
are they going to afford it from?
No, here's I mean,
Well, China
Two-
is just
selling the
gonna
rare
give it
earth
to
to
two things. Yeah, no, China, they're not going to buy anything the Chinese. Right? Seriously, they're not going to buy shit. They're going to be given. They're not,
Yep.
and much like what the Soviet Union did, and what the Russians currently do now in regards to their military export variants. It's not the newest, but it's almost there, and it's good enough. Now, this is, I mean, if the Chinese have plans to modernize North Korea, that's what's going to happen. They're going to give them some really nice loans, and they're going the Internal Development Bank in China. They set up their own bank for this kind of shit, which again has to do with the Belt and Roads Initiative. And what they're likely going to do, I think, would be, all right, here you go, here's a bunch. But they already have. They not only are they giving North Korea money, supporting them financially, they're giving them food, a lot of food.
Oh yeah, it's going to be a massive exchange here.
Yeah, and it's going to become with strings, of course, which it always does.
Wait, do you
what
guys
was I gonna
think
say?
North Korea is like a fascist state?
North Korea is a
No.
bit interesting because it has its own ideology. Now, as far as I understand,
Pretty fascist
it's called
ideology.
Juche. It's called Juche, I think,
It's
something like that.
Juche is a communist ideology. It's the same dog and Ulfric, hold on. It's the same dog and pony show that the Soviets and the Chinese did. It's essentially, to call it fascism is to be intellectually dishonest. It's the workers' party bullshit. It's a democracy, but it really isn't because it's actually a hereditary authoritarian regime. If you don't know a whole lot about Juche ideology, I haven't had any desire to read into it, but it is essentially just the Soviet system with North Korean idealism put into it. It's a little bit more racialist as well because, well, obviously they're a small nation. They're very very racially minded.
All of Asia is very racially minded, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, and another thing I think is possible is unification. I think is a fantasy, but a confederation, like a union, like you maintain the two systems and two countries, but under one flag.
Honestly, I don't know.
That could be possible in 20 years.
Well, maybe in 20 years, maybe. It's
20 years.
If things go good.
That's a given a bit too much, I think. Try maybe 50 because the amount of shit that has to be fixed, and if that system were to be attempted without any fuckery from outside forces who wouldn't want this to happen for whatever reason, I mean the amount of stuff that needs to be fixed in North Korea alone is
it's going to
quite
take
considerable. You're looking at I don't know if I'm stretching it when I say you're looking at, comparable to rebuilding Europe after the war, but I don't think that's too far off.
Well, except the Europeans were competent, but it's going to take 10 years alone just to remove all of the mines on the DMZ and on the North Korean side. That alone, then they actually have to build a road because their roads are basically just dirt. They have some pavement in Pyongyang, but a lot of it's just fucking dirt. Basically 60 to 75% of the population is starving or malnourished. You have these massive ghettos that obviously no one's allowed to look at, but videos have come out of. But let me shift to a chat message here, and we can talk about this. Will to Power says, we no longer live in a unipolar world. China is a rising giant with a population of 1 billion plus with an average IQ of 105. Europe reverting to the Westphalian nation state model benefits them, in my opinion. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that if we abolish the EU and NATO and things like that, that it's actually working within the interest of China?
No, because those individual nation states will still, at that point, they will put on policies that will counteract or try to counteract or balance out whatever the Chinese are doing.
I think he's also disregarding that China is under immense financial strain currently.
This would be my response as well. China, their military tech and their military is large, but they have no way to project it except on neighboring territories. So unless they start taking control of the South China Sea, which the United States won't allow and its allies won't allow, unless they actually fix their economy, because I'm not going to say it's entirely dependent on Western money per se, but a lot of it is just total dog shit,
Well, its GDP is based on its housing sector, effectively speaking. The Chinese currency is tied to construction materials or property.
Right.
So that's why China has massive ghost towns where no one lives. And as soon as the housing market in China is going to pop, the Chinese economy is going to be in for a rude awakening.
Yeah. If the Western nations break off and become... See, here's the thing that China doesn't want. China does not want independent nation states in Europe and in the United States that are self-reliant, because a lot of our imports come from China. A lot of our cheap, plastic crap comes from China. We buy it like there's no fucking tomorrow. And if we were to become independent of China and some of these other Eastern nations, I think it would totally collapse their economy, and we would see some type of reformation of the countries. So I think that actually it's the opposite of what Will to Power says, which is if the Western world returns to self-reliance and individual autonomous nation states, we're going to crush the rest of the world, especially if we form some type of councils.
Well, this is an interesting point, because the Chinese, I as far as I understand it, the Chinese are very much aware of this potential problem in self-reliant European states. Less importation, less buying from China, their trade goes to hell, and their basis for much of their economy also with it. And of course, what the Chinese have been attempting and are trying to attempt is the urbanizing of their populations. That to a certain extent, they've been quite successful at this. And still, there's millions out in the Chinese countryside, especially. You can
pack rats into a box. Doesn't mean it's a good living situation.
Well, yeah, sure, of course. I'm not. They are successful in so that they're trying to, because they know. I think they know what's going to have to happen, which is that they need to go towards an internal service economy.
Yeah, well,
because they need to because places of work must need to be considered, be created within China as well, right?
Julius,
considering the massive urban.
Hold on.
Considering the massive.
Julius, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had a point about the economy and the importation and the self-reliance of European states. It was the point that this is not just a situation for China, that they are reliant on European, but you see that in Bangladesh, the sort of Indian, Southeast Asian areas as well, where they have these where you see the Apple phones and H&M and all these brands, these giant corporations who get all the stuff made in these countries. And so I think if European nations were to gain self-reliance, you'd see a lot of economic trouble around the rest of the world, due to the majority of consumers being in Europe and then the United States. So I think that would be especially crippling to some of the way the economic systems are set up in these countries at the current way they're working.
Let us not forget that India and China are competing with one another for this manufacturing sector that the West is demanding. So it's something to keep in mind. We might see trade wars between the Indians and the Chinese, depending on how their economies hold up, growing in the future. So okay, any final thoughts on China or North Korea or anything like that, guys?
Oh, I have one final thought. I see a lot of Asian countries like South Korea and some South Asian countries that in the past years have become first world countries instead of third world. And right now, I would consider China a third world country, or let's say a second world country. But in the future, in the coming decades, I think they're going to become first world. Their middle class has tripled in the past 10 years, I think, and the next 10 years will double. We just see so much modernization happening in China. I don't think they're going to stay a poor, undeveloped country for long.
If you look at Shenzhen, for example, 15 years ago it was a rural area. Now it's the electronic juggernaut of China. Like that's where everything is constructed when it comes to home electronics. I mean, developing in China is like crazy fast.
Yeah, so they have major mega projects of building high-speed rail all over the country, highways, just modernizing. That happens in a couple of years. And I feel like in 10 years, they'll be up in the level of South Korea, maybe.
Well, alrighty then. Julius, final thoughts?
The last thing was just a note about the Chinese demographic development and how that's going to affect them. I don't think we'll see the same as here, but sort of the sort of incel and 80-20 thing. And if you were to see the same in China, it would be extremely detrimental to them due to the way the one child system and these sort of the birth rates out there are pretty threatening or pretty they look pretty dangerous, I would say. But that's a note we can go into at a later date.
Currently, the birth rates are up on a rise because the one-child policy was abolished, I think, 10 years ago. If I'm not mistaken.
My mistake.
Also,
but they also have more men than women.
It never was implemented when it comes to minorities within China. So the Uyghur group, there's a Turkic group in northern China. They never were subject to these laws. So it was only Han Chinese that were subject to the one-child policy. Also, you could pay your way out of it.
Right. Okay. Let's go ahead and wrap this up here. As far as Discord is concerned, we're still going to talk about cultural Marxism, but I'm going to hop off Discord. Any final thoughts, anybody on the stream? Any topics you want to talk about in the future? Don't all speak at once. Very, very lively Discord. Come on, guys. Get some fucking energy. Stop smoking weed. Stop jerking off. Get some energy.
Papa is so fun.
Man, I lost all my data on my fucking phone. I can't be with it all the time.
Yeah, you gotta keep it up. Gotta keep the high energy going.
Well, I found it interesting when someone mentioned that mentioned China's one-child policy, because if you guys don't know, as the result of that, in China, men outnumber women by, I think, 30 million. So within the next few generations, we're going to see a huge drop in population demographics.
Yeah,
incel
China culture
is probably going to fight a couple of wars to get rid of that abundance of young, able-bodied men.
Either that, or we're going to see a huge rise in incel culture. But All right. Well, thanks for everyone coming
no.
onto the stream.
Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you guys
Thank
later.
you.
All right. How's it going, chat? We're out of the Discord now. Sorry for the autism at the start. Tortex is always fun to talk to, but I will be talking about cultural Marxism now. If you guys could just give me 2 minutes so I can go grab some water because I'm going to be talking a lot. So just give me 2 minutes. We're going to hang out just for a sec. Type in the chat. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. What's going on, guys? What did I miss? Let's see. Hey, Bilal, what's going on? No, you missed a good conversation. We were talking about the EU, and we talked a little bit about China, North Korea, things like that. It was a good discussion. Let's see. Yes, Smash for Cash. It is the old head. I've just edited it slightly. Spider58, how's it going? More like cultural liberalism. We live in a liberal culture, not a Marxist one. Well, I sort of disagree with that, and I'll kind of show you why. So, if everyone's ready, we'll go ahead and get started with this. Let me put this over here real quick. I gotta pull up my image. So we're going to go through the history and the formation of cultural Marxism, but more importantly, we're going to really evaluate the reason why we're caught in the cultural traps that we're in today. Why things are so critical of tradition and old moral value systems and things like that. Why there's been this new way of thinking that's appeared in the Western world. Yes, Mulek, I saw your question, but I really couldn't put it forward to the guest, so we were kind of talking about something completely different. Have you heard of metamodernism? Yes, I have. Very interesting. James Edward, I appreciate the comment, and we'll get there, but I want to go like down to the details essentially of this because some people don't seem to understand this. But first off, let's go through some books. So everyone, I'll give you a second. Bust out your notepads, get a pen and paper, write down all of this because these are the primary sources that you should read if you're curious about the culture of Marxism or why we found ourselves in the situation that we're in today and things like that. So I'll give you 1 sec. Hopefully everyone's enjoying the stream so far. See the Frankfurt School subverted tradition. I'm going to need a citation. That's essentially what I'm doing. Are you ready for my citations? All right, so let's look at some primary sources I think everyone should read in understanding this. We've got The Devil's Pleasure Palace, The Cult of Critical Theory and the Subversion of the West by Michael Walsh. Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism by Lawrence W. Reed. The Revolt Against the Masses, How Liberalism Has Undermined the Middle Class by Fred Siegel. Of course, Culture of Critique by Kevin MacDonald. The Dialectical Imagination, A History of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research by Martin J. And then, where's my other reading list here? And then we have The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans, Jewish Domination of Weimar Germany by Eckhart Verlag, The International Jew by Henry Ford, classic. And I think there's a couple more. I'll have to dig up my reading list later. James Edwards said, yes, we're ready for you to cite that it's the Jews that came out of the Frankfurt School and came to the United States. Yes. If you guys want to scroll backwards and pause it or watch the video when it's uploaded, go for it. But I'm just putting them out there in the public space so that people can look back on it if they're curious. What was the third one? Sure. Valkyrie, I'll put all of them in the description of the live stream when it gets uploaded onto YouTube after this is done. Spoiler alert, I don't type 10,000 words per minute. Am I a freak of nature? Yes. Only true Aryan men can type at 10,000 words per minute. Yes, Avalon, welcome to AP Holocaust History. All right, let's start from the top here. And this is going to go around kind of in circles. It's not just a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a sort of like a web, let's say, a web of lies and deceit. So let's start from the top. So we have the Weimar Republic. Everyone should be familiar with that. And this degenerate society in the post-World War I period spawns a group of German intellectuals. And these German intellectuals create what we know as the Frankfurt School, of course. But there's a little bit more to that. The Soviet Union, through the KGB, has actually funded these intellectuals because they're very pro-Marxist. These Marxist intellectuals that came out of the Weimar Republic and established things like the Frankfurt School. And I could go into the history of the Frankfurt School, but most people are already aware of what that is and how it came to be. Essentially, they had to flee Germany because, of course, these degenerates and these Marxist intellectuals were kicked out of the country. Otherwise, they would have been seized and put in a camp. But all right-wing dissidents should have a secretary to handle this type of stuff. Yes, Capable Guardian, I agree. So what does the Frankfurt School do? Well, the Frankfurt School and these intellectuals, they end up taking over the social science faculties. And what these people in the social sciences do is they push progressivism, which is an ideology that was spawned to tear down the West and create a Marxist revolution under the guise of the Soviets, because the Soviets understood subversion very well. And essentially what they wanted to do, because they knew that they could not beat the United States in a flat-out war, they created these institutions and sent out agents into the Western world to subvert the society as a whole. If you're curious about that, you can watch the interview or multiple interviews with Yuri Bezmenov, the former KGB agent. Now, what do these intellectuals in the social sciences do? They spawn, I guess you could say, a positivist crisis. And what this does is it replaces the scientific method with critical theory. The typical way that we use reason and evidence and rationality in the Aristotelian way was subverted by this critical theory concept. Now, what critical theory does is it spawns relativism and political correctness. Now, relativism is this idea that nothing is absolute. There's no universality, so to speak, that everything can be questioned, changed, all the old traditions. Science itself can be relative to the perspective of the people viewing it, which is complete nonsense. The whole point of science is that it's objective and observable and peer-reviewed and things like that. GGCHB. No, the USSR would not have won a conventional war against the West in Europe. That is an outright lie, especially not after the post-war period where essentially all of their industry and their army was completely collapsing. It doesn't even matter how big the army was. They could not have mounted an attack against the defenses of the West. And even the generals at the time knew this, like Patton. I did a video on his thoughts on the Soviet Union. So we have this critical theory, this relativism, not just moral relativism, but scientific relativism. You know, this whole social construct nonsense. Now, what this relativism does is that it really attacks people's common sense, and it attacks these empirical values that spawned not only out of the ancient Greek world, but out of the European Renaissance as a whole. Now, because of this relativism, we get things like political correctness. And this political correctness culture attacks certain scientific institutes that look into certain research topics. And this, of course, means biological differences between the races and the genders, our relationship with the natural world, because natural law is, in essence, the opposite of Marxism. Marxism is a denial of natural laws. And essentially, these intellectuals tell us not to trust common sense and empiric evidence. They know better. It's an appeal to authority. And as this spreads, they gain more and more followers and more useful idiots, like the leftists that we see today are just useful idiots. They don't actually know what they're talking about. Let me just read in the chat here. So let's go back to progressivism, this idea of a progressive society. Now, what does progressivism do? Well, it attacks tradition, the traditions of the Western world. And let's look at religion. So progressivism attacks the traditions of the religions of Europe. And this means a direct attack on chastity and marriage. When you attack chaste attitudes and sexual shaming, you get single parenthood and the sexual revolution, because people are no longer shamed into being responsible. There's no abstract concept of duty to the family unit or to yourself, meaning that you basically have no personal responsibility because it's all relative. You know, these old traditions and all this shit. No, it's just a social contract. It doesn't actually mean anything. It's not important. You know, your liberation is more important. So what these single parent households do, these broken families, as we understand it today, these broken families cause crime. People who come from a broken family are statistically more likely to become criminals than anywhere else. So now, because these Marxists have attacked the traditions of chastity and marriage, we have all these broken homes. It's causing more crime. Now, crime, of course, prevents a nation from being productive. People are stealing and murdering from each other. They cannot be productive. They cannot run their factories. They cannot have a military. And at the same time, the unity of the nation collapses because crime spreads this idea that you have to look over your shoulder everywhere you go, that nowhere is safe. You can't just live out a normal life free of the fear of being robbed or murdered or raped or something like that. Now, also, because it attacked the traditional institute of marriage, we get higher divorce rates. The sexual liberation allows for the breakup of traditional marriages. Women are no longer held to any responsibility. Men are no longer held to any responsibility to stay in the family unit. And of course, these high divorce rates contribute to the broken family concept, which increases crime. Now, progressivism also attacks the family structure as a whole, which essentially means just attacking gender roles. And when you attack gender roles, you cause low birth rates. Because when you have a whole bunch of mentally deranged people running around claiming that they're gay or trans or things like this, they're not able to have biological children, which causes a decline in the birth rates of the Western nation, which is essentially, in the Soviet eyes, a decrease in manpower. Also, homos and trannies and shit like this, they're not very masculine. They don't make good soldiers. So, also, these low birth rates contribute to mass immigration. It's used as an excuse for mass immigration, as we've seen. Well, no one wants to do those dirty jobs, so we just have to bring in more and more immigrants. That's the excuse they need to bring in more migrants. Now, what do migrants do? Migrants cause crime because they're taken from the third world, which has a lower average IQ. IQ is linked directly to criminality. It increases crime and decreases unity within the nation, causing chaos. Just reading the chat here. Yes, Dresh, that is correct. The Soviet Union was Bolshevism was a Jewish construct. The Frankfurt School was mostly German and French Jews. That is correct. Now, also, when progressivism attacks the standard gender roles, they're essentially increasing the labor supply of the nation by 50%. What does this do? Well, it allows for cheap labor. It also contributes to the broken homes that we talked about earlier, because now women are told or taught to believe that they need to go out there and engage in the workplace. And by doing that, you break up the family. I mean, how many times have you seen a divorced family where both the husband and the wife were working? They don't have enough time for one another, and it breaks the family apart. Now, this cheap labor gives wealth to industry, big corporations and banks and things like this. So let's also look at property. Progressivism attacks the traditional notion of private property, as all Marxists do. Now, because of this, they have the justification to establish a welfare state. And this is not a right-wing socialist system, but a left-wing social system, which essentially means that anyone can receive welfare no matter what, no qualifications, barely any standards. You just ask for money, and if you qualify for it, they give it to you. And it's a shit ton of money as well. So, what does this massive welfare spending do? Well, it creates budget deficits. What do you need to run a welfare state like this? You need to take on debt, which works in the interest of the bankers. Now, what these bankers do is they basically print money for the government, and as the government receives this money, they take it on a loss. For every dollar printed, it costs, like $1.06. That's the short of it. I could go into more detail, but I won't. Now, this budget deficit, because of the welfare state, also leads to a social security crisis, a raising of taxes, and you have to print money, like I said, which causes inflation. And inflation reduces the purchasing power of everyone, but it mostly affects the lower and middle class. Now, also, when you raise taxes, you shrink the middle class. And the middle class is one of the strongest aspects of the Western world, or used to be, because they had a large, semi-intelligent, thriving population that was able to engage in certain economic activities. The Soviet Union did not have this. You had two distinct classes of people. Yes, democracy is fake. Democracy never existed and never will. Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. There's a bit more nuance to that, but so this huge budget deficit, taking on of debt, we've seen the rising debt of the Western world, combined with cheap labor. And I'll read something here. The conditions like dysgenics, poverty, and lack of social cohesion reduce the ability of the population to revert the situation. It is a self-perpetuating system. The system is aided at all levels by political corruption and useful idiots. The logical result of capitalism as a goal instead of capitalism as a tool. They're essentially using neoliberalism as a tool to collapse the West. Now, what is cheap labor and taking on debt? Who does that benefit? Well, it benefits the international banks and the corporations. Well, who owns the corporations? Or sorry, who owns the media in the Western world? Who owns the primary source of information for 90% of the country up until the invention of the internet? Well, it's the mass media, and this mass media is owned by like 5 or 6 corporations now, who are all financed and given loans by the international banks. Now, what does the mass media push on people? It's progressivism. This is the self-perpetuating cycle. All of these things, it's a circular pattern in this regard. Looking at the chat here. Ruffian says 2 choices, and the best you can hope for is getting fucked or fucked harder. The book The Authoritarian Personality, published in 1950, is also a fantastic insight into what our enemies think of us and are trying to do to us. Yes, Spider, I agree. The entire point of leftism is to attack and destroy the middle class to secure elite power. This is essentially what they're doing. They want to shrink the middle class and create a permanent underclass separated by the elites. This is what happened in every single communist nation that has ever existed. All right, let's keep going here. Now, what do all of these things lead to? Like I said earlier, it creates disunity in the nation. There's no longer any community trust. It creates poverty and this permanent underclass. And I'll read a quote here. Democracy may be blamed, but the real problem is the representative system. Had immigration been subjected to a democratic vote, it would have been halted in all Western nations decades ago. Even if such a vote was carried out today, immigration may be halted. So I think democracy is a part of it, of course. Obviously, I don't agree with the democratic system, but I think the primary issue is that it was used against us. Again, through this critical theory, this progressivism, we allowed universality in suffrage to come to fruition. Essentially, everybody has the right to vote if they're a citizen. And nowadays, everyone has the right to vote even if they're not citizens. It's this constantly compounding bullshit. You know, if you're going to have a democracy, there has to be limits in place as to who can vote, because otherwise you will have one group of people who are productive giving resources by force or taken from them by force to those who are not productive because they have the same voting rights. This egalitarianism between these two groups is what really fucks over the whole system as a whole. Now, I can make plenty of arguments against the theory of democracy in and of itself, but it's being used as a tool to tear down the Western world. Just going to read the chat here. Yep. That's right. The more diverse the population gets, the more hellish the democracy gets. Yep, because everyone's treated as equal. You really cannot have equal representation in a country where you have those who provide and those who take. Oh, yeah, that's correct. There's never going to be a referendum on mass immigration. They're not going to let it happen. We've devolved way past that point. Can fascism come to America? Perhaps. There's a couple of ways that it might come to America. Let's see, where was... Oh, here it is. So, let's go over something very interesting when it talks about overrepresentation. Give me one sec. So we talked about banks and corporations and all of this owning media corporations. Let's go over some of who actually owns these. if we can narrow it down to a specific group of individuals. I think that we can. So let's go through that right now. Everyone bust out your pen and paper. I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can because it's very long. And these numbers are from the census. And they're from 2016. So some of this is subject to change. Keep that in mind. Some of this is subject to change. But these stats are only 2 years old. So who controls big media? Of the 12 senior executives of the big 6 media corporations that I talked about earlier, 9 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 75%. And of course, Jews are approximately 2% of the US population. Therefore, Jews and spouses of Jews are overrepresented among the senior executives of the big 6 media corporations by a factor of 37.5 times, or 3,750%. Who controls Hollywood? Of the 60 senior executives of the major Hollywood studios, trade unions, and talent agencies, 50 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 83%. Again, Jews are approximately 2% of the US population. Therefore, Jews and spouses of Jews are overrepresented among the senior executives of the major Hollywood studios, trade unions, and talent agencies by a factor of 41 times, or 4,100%. Who controls television? Of the 64 senior executives of the major television broadcast networks, cable networks, and production companies, 57 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 89%. Therefore, Jews and spouses of Jews are overrepresented among senior executives of the major television broadcast networks, cable networks, and production companies by a factor of 44.5 times, or 4,400%. Now, who controls music? Of the 50 senior executives of the major music labels, trade organizations, 39 are Jews. This is a numerical representation of 78%, or an overrepresentation by a factor of 3,900%. Who controls the radio? Of the 46 senior executives of the major radio broadcast networks and station owners, 28 are Jews. This is a numerical representation of 61%, or a overrepresentation of 3,000%. Now, who controls advertising? Of the 46 senior executives of the major advertising corporations and trade associations, 31 are Jews. This is a numerical representation of 67%. They are overrepresented by a factor of 3,300%. According to their populations, of course, keep that in mind. So, now who controls the news? Of the 67 senior executives of the major television and radio networks, 47 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 70%, or an overrepresentation by a factor of 3,500%. Now, who controls the news? Part 2. Of the 65 senior executives of the major newspapers and news magazines, 42 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 65%, or an overrepresentation by a factor of 3,200%. Take a break here and read the chat just a little bit. It's because of their high IQ. Oy vey. Yes, I'm sure a numerical overrepresentation of 4,000% is just because of their IQ. Even though there are more high IQ whites than there are the entire population of the Jewish persons in the United States. Yeah, I know. Jews control the news. Whoa. Big ideas. Spoiler alert says, having a television is like having a Jew in your living room. Ah, that's funny. All right, let's look at the internet. Are you ready to look at the internet? Who controls eBay? Of the 9 eBay executives, 6 are Jews. And I'll speed this up a little bit, but keep in mind the overrepresentation is by a factor of between 500 and 4,000%. But I'll just run through this real quick. Who controls Apple? Of the 10 Apple executives, 3 are Jews. That's a 30% representation. Who controls Yahoo? Of the 13 Yahoo executives, 8 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 62%. Who controls Google? Of these 6 Google executives, 4 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 67%. Who controls Amazon? Of the 11 Amazon.com executives, 8 are Jews. This is a numerical representation of 73%. And of the 9 Amazon.com directors, 6 of them are Jews. Who controls Facebook? Of the 3 Facebook executives, 3 are Jews. That's, of course, a numerical representation of 100%. Of the 7 Facebook directors, 4 are Jews. Who controls Microsoft? Of the 17 Microsoft executives, 6 are Jews. Of the 9 Microsoft directors, 5 are Jews. Who controls Wikimedia? Of the 17 Wikimedia senior staff and trustees, 5 are Jews. And there's a few more big websites, but that pretty much covers everything. And yes, Spider, nepotism and networking is what allows things like this to happen. Absolutely. Brentum, is Brave browser safe? Yes, I use Brave on my phone. It's a good browser. Okay, let's look at the banking industry. Oh boy. No surprises here, I assume. Who controls the economy? Of the 60 senior officials of the U.S. government, economic, financial, and monetary institutions, 39 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 65%. And these are subject to change because of the new administration, but I don't suppose it will change that much. Now, who controls Wall Street? Of the 51 senior executives of the major Wall Street banks, trade exchanges, and regulatory agencies, 37 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 72%. Now, who controls Wall Street? Part 2. Of the 40 senior executives of the major Wall Street mutual funds, private equity funds, hedge funds, and brokerages, 26 are Jews. This is a representation of 65%. Who controls Goldman Sachs? Of the 9 Goldman Sachs executives, 7 are Jews. This is a representation of 78%. Of the 12 Goldman Sachs directors, 6 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is 50% representation. Of the 33 Goldman Sachs management committee members, 20 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. It's a representation of 61%. Who controls JP Morgan Chase, another large bank? Of the 10 JP Morgan Chase operating committee members, 9 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 90%. Of the 11 JP Morgan Chase directors, 6 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 45%. Now, this is subject to change, but let's look at the Treasury Department. Of the 26 U.S. Treasury Department senior officials, 18 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. No surprise there. Now, the Federal Reserve System. Of the 7 Federal Reserve Board governors, 4 are Jews. It's a representation of 57%. Of the Federal Reserve District Bank presidents, 12 in total, 4 of them are Jews. This is a representation of 33%, not so bad. Let's go back to the chat here. The United States is a gay disco. Well, I can't say I disagree. Spoiler alert, I think that the spoiler alert says pornography should obviously be illegal. I think the production of pornography should be outlawed. So let's look at the Obama administration. And we're going to talk a little bit about democracy under the Obama administration and overrepresentation. So who controls the Obama, or who controlled the Obama White House? Of the 11 current and former senior advisors of President Barack Obama, 9 are Jews, partial Jews or have Jewish spouses. It's a representation of 82%. Who controls the Senate? As of 2016, of the 20 U.S. Senate committee chairmen, 8 are Jews or partial Jews. It's a representation of 40%. Who controls the Congress as of 2016? Of the 42 U.S. committee chairmen and ranking members, 6 are Jews. This is a closer representation of 14%. Who controls the Supreme Court? Again, as of 2016. Of the 9 U.S. Supreme Court justices, 4 are Jews or partial Jews. This is a representation of 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44%. 44% Moloch, I think some of them vary depending on the information that's available. Again, this is coming from the census. We need porn so weak men don't procreate. It's too much of a cancer. Too much of a problem. All right. So again, let's look at the State Department during the Obama administration, 2016. Of the 74 U.S. State Department senior officials, 40 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 54%. Who controls the Justice Department? Of the 47 U.S. Justice Department senior officials, 22 are Jews. This is a representation of 47%. Who controls the Defense Department? Of the 111 U.S. Defense Department senior officials, 40 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 36%. Who controls the Treasury Department? Of the 26 U.S. Treasury Department senior officials, 18 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 69%. No surprise there. Let's see. Someone sent me a message. All right, let's look at the chat here because we're going to start moving on. Yeah, spoiler, it would have been 5, but Obama did not get his pick for Supreme Court. So you guys are still talking about porn. Let's get off the porn chat, please. All right, let's see here. Let's look at the Council on Foreign Relations. Part 1. Of the 43 Council on Foreign Relations directors, 28 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 65%. So who controls the Council on Foreign Relations? Part 2. Of the 55 Council on Foreign Relations think tank members, 31 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 56%. So let's look at some of the quote-unquote pillars of normal society, of the normie culture. Who controls Ivy League universities? Of the 24 senior administrators of Ivy League colleges and universities, 20 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 83%. Who controls the think tanks? Of the 30 senior executives of the major think tanks, 18 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a numerical representation of 60%. Now, who controls professional sports? Of the 60 senior executives of the major sports leagues, talent agencies, and media outlets, 43 are Jews. This is a numerical representation of 72%. Yeah, normies, am I right? Now, who controls the Anti-Defamation League? Of the 53 executives and directors of the Anti-Defamation League, 53 are Jews. Really makes you think, right? No surprises there, but I think it's worth mentioning. Who controls the Southern Poverty Law Center? Of the 22 Southern Poverty Law Center senior program staff members, 15 are Jews. This is a representation of 68%. Of the 13 Southern Poverty Law Center directors, 8 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 62%. Who controls the American Civil Liberties Union? Of the 9 executives of the American Civil Liberties Union, 4 are Jews. This is a representation of 44%. Now, who controls the Defense Policy Board? Of the 22 Defense Policy Board members, 14 are Jews or have Jewish spouses. This is a representation of 64%. Now, of course, we can do this without basically any major industry and find significant overrepresentation. Now, if purely nepotism and in-group preference and high IQ can account for this, well, we have some rethinking to do because, again, this group of people in the United States, and keep in mind, the United States has the second highest population of people of Jewish descent outside of Israel. And yet still they are only 2% of the population. Yet they have dominated every single major financial or corporate industry in the United States. They're overrepresented in the government structure. They're overrepresented in these hate speech groups like the ADL and the SPLC. There is a common theme here that some people just want to ignore. And you have to keep in mind that many of these people are either dual citizens or have loyalties to the Jewish ethno-state that exists in the Middle East. And so obviously they push for policies, both in the government and in the public life, that are pro-Israeli. They are taking United States tax dollar and sending young American men off to die in some desert because their interest, they use their influence and their power, their nepotism, to influence the policies of the United States. So when people talk about, oh, the United States is so awful, no, we're not talking about the United States people. We're talking about a corrupt and infiltrated government and financial system that is not ours to control. Valkyrie says, I often think the 2% is a myth and there are far more. Could be. I have to use the data that's available to me, unfortunately. Do you think we're being NSA monitored right now? Oh, absolutely. I bet the ADL's on the phone right now. Listen to it. So, this to kind of conclude this topic here. Excuse me. This can only mean one of two things. Either A, we live in a true meritocracy and Jews are 20 times more capable in finance than whites. If we use the rounded down rough average of a 100 IQ figure for whites, this would mean, basing things on IQ solely, of course, the Jews running for our financial system have IQs in the neighborhood of 2,000, given... Sorry. So let's be generous here and attribute Jewish financial acumen to something else. What would that be? It's certainly not their skills that would allow them to be represented 20 times higher than their white and Asian peers. Or option B, this massive overrepresentation is due to something other than merit and skill, something less noble, something uglier, like blatant nepotism and gaming of the hiring and promotion system. But to entertain this notion would surely be racist and anti-Semitic, right? I mean, we're only talking about 3,250% overrepresentation. Check your fucking white privilege. What's a few orders of magnitude between friends, am I right? Now, if it was only the financial system, it would be mind-boggling enough. But as I've shown, it's everything: media, academia, global policy bodies, the White House, the Pentagon, the tech world, sports, everything, every aspect of life. There is an overrepresentation of an extremely small minority of people. We're talking a minority of people that should be a statistical anomaly as far as trends are concerned. But somehow, you know, just because they have a high IQ suddenly makes this possible. You should assume that everything you say and do is being monitored, but at this point, you shouldn't give a shit. Because the more people are talking about it, the more people... I mean, what are they going to do? Put us all in jail? They can certainly try. I don't think you should be afraid to talk about issues that you think are important. Now, that doesn't mean that you should go around screaming, you know, gas this and gas that. Obviously not. We don't want to promote violence or anything like that. But at some point, you have to realize that you have to talk about these issues. These things are important. Sorry. Racism and anti-Semitism should be compulsory. They're beautiful things. Yes, thank you, chat. I think anti-Semitism is a virtue, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's going to about do it for this stream. Chat, if you have any topics you want to bring up real quick or any questions you want to ask me, go for it. I'll stick around for a few more minutes, but I do have some stuff to do later. So I hope everyone enjoyed the stream. Yeah, it's a good thing I live in America, Dresh. It's a good thing that I've got a gun underneath my desk. So if they try and take away my basic human rights, I can start busting caps. Yeah, I'm not sure if we'll stream tomorrow. I don't have a whole lot of topics. Unless something comes up that I think is super important, I think we're just going to take a day off on that. Yeah, Smash for Cash. The reason I do it at this time is because it's fairly good for Europeans and fairly good for Americans as well. It's the best time that I can think of for streaming for both, because the audience, according to my analytic, according to the analytics, the population is split about 50-50, half America, half Europe. So some Australians in there as well. Yeah, Valkyrie, I agree. Let's take some time off from all of this. I think tomorrow will be the day off. Oh, don't forget, check the description. Join us on the Discord if you're not already on the Discord, so that you can interact with us. And if you'd like to get on the stream in the future, make sure that you join the Discord and message me so I can add you to the list. Glakun says, which book will you do after Aristotle? Good question. I have a couple of choices, but I'm not decided yet. We'll see where the tide goes. So before I end the stream, make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed. Spread the channel around if you enjoyed this content. But we're going to head out now. Pseudo-analyst says, I didn't want to derail the stream, even though I agree with most of what you said. The Frankfurt School founders were traditionalists. Read the essays, Future of Marriage, Max Horkheimer. Horkheimer and Adorno actually believed in the destruction of the West. Their books are on my reading list as well. So we are going to explore Horkheimer and the critical theorists. Don't worry about that. We'll get there. For those who are worried about Discord, as I recommended yesterday, create an email address that's not associated with any of your other accounts, and use that to create a Discord account, and don't post any personal information. There's no way that they can dox you if you follow those 2 steps. That's just that's my advice. Discord is a good tool. You just have to be smart about it. Just don't post personal information, and don't use any accounts that are linked to your real life. Very simple. Yeah, Proton Mail and Tor. There you go. We might switch over to Goy Chat, but the problem is most people don't know what that is and don't use it. So the best way to reach the audience is through a platform like Discord. It's the reason why I use Twitter. You know, Twitter fucking blows ass, but it's the best way to network with people. Eleanor, yes, we might do a stream this weekend, depending on what's going on. To get added to verified members, do we have to be on the voice stream or just in chat? If you want to get verified on the Discord, you just have to sit down with me in a voice call so I can verify who you are. I trust me, I remember everybody who comments in the chats, but I just don't know you that well. And the verified section is for people who I've personally spoken to and been able to vet. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, that's going to be the end of the stream. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Enjoy the last of your weekend. God damn it, Trish. Hold on. Last question. Can we post book links there? All books allowed? Yes, you can post links. If you want to advertise in the Discord, just message me first, and then I'll add it to the promoted section. So, all right, now we're ending. No more questions. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll talk to you guys later.